You're still watching Economic Outlook with me, Aline Wiratmaja. Indonesia's economy recorded a solid growth in 2022 despite the growing uncertainties in the global economy. The growth momentum is expected to continue this year as the removal of the public mobility restrictions will further spur economic activities and push up household spending.
Bank Indonesia has projected that Indonesia's economy will continue to record a solid growth at a range of 4.5 to 5.3% this year, following the nation's robust economic performance in 2022 despite uncertainties in the global economy. In an official statement issued recently, the Indonesian Central Bank said the country's high household consumption and investment would further accelerate the pace of the economic growth, although the estimated slowdown in the global economy could affect the country's exports. The prediction is also in line with the increase in community mobility after the removal of the community activity or PPKM restrictions, improved business prospects, an increase in foreign investment, and realization of a number of national strategic projects. Data from the Central Statistics Agency or BPS has shown that in the fourth quarter of the 2022, Indonesia's economic growth remained high at 5.01% year-on-year amidst slowing global economic growth. With these developments, Indonesia's overall growth in 2022 was recorded at 5.3% year-on-year, a steep increase from 3.70% in the previous year. The strong economic growth was supported by almost all components of the gross domestic product or GDP. For example, household consumption grew 4.48% in 2022, partly due to the increased mobility of the people, especially during Christmas and New Year holidays, as well as continued distribution of social assistance for the poor. Exports also grew 14.93%, driven by strong demand from major trading partners for the country's commodities. Meanwhile, a number of global institutions have downgraded their expectations for Indonesia's gross domestic products or GDP growth in 2023, as demand from major trade partners appears set to remain low. In its Indonesia Economic Prospect or IEP report published in December last year, the World Bank cut Indonesia's 2023 economic growth outlook to 4.8% from its September prediction of 5%. While the institution noted that Indonesia's economy would likely see sustained growth over the next few years, that growth will be softening in the short term. The Asian Development Bank or ADB also cut Indonesia's 2023 GDP growth projection to 4.8% from its previous estimate of 5%. The 2023 number was lower than the 5.4% growth projected for 2022, as worsening headwinds were expected to continue this year due to slower demand from advanced economies. However, in its most recent report, the International Monetary Fund or IMF projected a slight increase to its global growth outlook for 2023 due to surprisingly resilient demand in the United States and Europe. Easing energy costs and reopening of China's economy after Beijing abandoned its strict COVID-19 restrictions. It still sees the pace of global growth falling this year compared with 2022, but with a smaller margin than it predicted in October. The IMF is now forecasting 2.9% growth for 2023, up from a 2.7% forecast in October versus 3.4% growth last year. Finance Minister Sri Mulyani has said that although the global economy will come under increasing pressure next year, Indonesia will be quite resilient against the situation. She is confident the country's projected economic growth of about 5% this year would be achieved. The finance minister believes the country's large household spending as the main driver of the economic growth will further increase as the easing of the inflation in the country would help maintain the people's buying power. The projected increase in investments and an increase in exports are also expected to help boost the economic growth, although it will not be as high as last year.
Indonesia's exports are expected to post a lower growth this year as the global economic slowdown has begun to reduce demand. This will make the government to work extra hard to maintain the household spending to ensure that the country's economic growth target is on track. And it is an honor for us to have Ibu Masyita Crystallin, Special Advisor to the Minister of Finance here today. She will share with us her views on the latest development in our economy and about the government's program in coping with the impact of the global economic slowdown on Indonesia. Welcome to Economic Outlook. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mbak Alin.
So in 2022, Indonesia managed to record the best GDP growth since 2013. How can we maintain this growth consistency trend?
First of all, we have to look at the different growth drivers, right? We're usually looking at growth from two sides. First is the expenditure side. You're looking at consumption, investment, government expenditure, and export and import. And on the other hand, we're also looking at bisectoral. We see agriculture, tourism, etc. So in 2021, actually almost all sectors, by sectors, is already exceeding the number before the pandemic, if we're looking at, except the tourism and also hotel and restaurant. And in 2022, we have managed also to have all sectors, including the tourism and hotel and restaurant, to be above the level before the pandemic. If we're looking at from the expenditure side, from the consumption is still more than 50% of our GDP. It's already higher than before the pandemic. Investment, 30% of GDP, also already higher than the pandemic, and government expenditure. Now, the function of government expenditure here is a bit different. So during the pandemic, we're playing the role as shock absorber. So it's a counter-cyclical government measure. And for that, we are usually, when the business cycle is slow, the government will increase the spending. And when it's already above the natural rate, then we usually is going to start to slowing down government expenditure, which is why we're planning to have the government fiscal deficit to come back to below 3% after 3 years of the pandemic. Supposed to be this year will be less than 3% the first time, but apparently it happened during the 2022. So what should we do to increase or to maintain growth? First, we have to maintain the purchasing power, to maintain the consumption side. Here we have several subsidy and support for the bottom 40%, usually between decile 1 until decile 4. If we're looking at the number of unemployment rate and poverty, it's already improving since the pandemic consecutively, although the number is still slightly above the level before the pandemic, but it's pretty much, we're getting there, we're close. To improve the investment, we have several avenues, right? The government has created the Sovereign Wealth Fund to do asset recycling, to increase more infrastructure investment. Also, we create different locus of growth. So, for example, in the original GDP composition in Indonesia, the biggest part is still Java, almost 60% of total GDP. So if we want to maintain growth, we need to improve the other islands. We are currently developing Kalimantan with the new capital city. We're also working on the Sulawesi as well and Papua. So we're creating new locus of growth, not just from the sectoral point of view, but also from the regional point of view. And lastly, we also try to accelerate and improve the value addition of each sectors. So if we're usually in the primary sectors or lower value added service sectors, now we're moving more into a higher value added service sectors. We're working on the downstreaming of some of the industry, including the mineral resource and commodity sector.
So amid the global uncertainties as well as the volatilities right now, how can we better mitigate the risk as we have a lot to achieve? As you mentioned before, those are our strategies for this year.
Yeah. The biggest risk to the global economy last year was inflation. And also energy crisis, right? Because of the increased price of energy due to the Russia invasion to Ukraine, but also in general because of the situation after the pandemic. Inflation will remain a key factors, I think, this year. If you're looking at Indonesia inflation number, it's still quite high. Compared to our usual number. However, if compared to other emerging economies, some countries have almost 100% of inflation rate. Even US and European countries have a lot higher rate of inflation compared to Indonesia. So of course, during the economic recovery, it's normal for inflation to increase, but we try to maintain the volatility and the increase to not to accelerate too much, yeah, for to maintain the purchasing power or the consumption side. The second source of risk is still commodity price. This will also stem from the geopolitical condition, but also that the global supply chain may not have returned to the original level. But we're looking at the very high base of last year, commodity price. If we assume commodity price will slow down this year, then another risk for commodity exporter countries such as Indonesia will be a moderation of revenue coming from the commodity income. Third is something that sometimes we in Indonesia take it for granted, yeah. The trust of the global community to our policy, both from the macro side, fiscal and monetary, but also from the financial sector side. Because if we remember during the first 2 years of the pandemic, we've seen 140 plus global country rating downgrades all over the world, not just for emerging market or low income countries, also advanced economy. And Indonesia has maintained a stable rating downgrades during that period. And we also have some version of that monetization through our SKB from the Bank Indonesia. It's also getting a lot of trust from the global community as well, that even though we're also facing with inflation, although a bit lower, we're also struggling with growth, even though you can see that our growth number is in the moderate level. And also financial sector volatility, despite all that, we still maintain the credit ratings. And I think that is something that we have to continue in the future.
Stability, that's what Indonesia has to offer. So I would like to elaborate more. You mentioned that there's a moderation of revenue due to the easing of the commodity prices this year. So we have achieved the fiscal deficit below 3% before, and how can we maintain it this year? What are the challenges? As you mentioned before, we have the moderation of revenue.
So this is the beauty of automatic stabilizer in the managing fiscal stance, yeah. So one automatic stabilizer that we have is tax. So whenever revenue is going up, tax usually goes up, and it's placed as a counter-cyclical for fiscal policy, right? For the subsidy on energy, that will also dampen the impact of inflation on energy and hence overall inflation in Indonesia, is also somewhat automatic, right? Because whenever last year revenue from commodity goes up, the subsidy goes up, so it's kind of neutralized the two. So when subsidy goes up, you're actually financed also by the increase in revenue. What happened if the revenue is not as high as previously because of the moderation of global commodity price? Then the subsidy also is automatically lower, right? Because the high price of the oil price in the previous year will not happen if that assumptions happen. So this automatic stabilizer will help in terms of the fiscal balance. However, in the future, Indonesia is currently working on doing subsidy reform, right? The best subsidy is actually if you can do direct transfer by name, by address. So we know who we can help. Yeah, this help with the poverty number, especially the extreme poverty. But we don't have enough data for that. We still have inclusion and exclusion error, and the data by name, by address, we only have less than 30%, around 25%. The target is going to up to bottom 40% and in fact to bottom 50%. So we need to still improve this database. Once we have a good mechanism to do direct transfer, then this commodity subsidy, that's actually very regressive, yeah, because when you subsidize commodities such as oil, then people who consume more will benefit more, right? So it's regressive for inequality. So we are trying to transition, but of course we still have to maintain inflation and purchasing power in general. So the government is trying to do it in moderation as well.
So direct transfers is considered better because I know some government also provide subsidies to their public transportation, so it can be enjoyed by the middle low income families.
Yes, yes, that's also good, yeah. Because the higher the proportion of subsidies going to the middle and lower income, the better also for consumption, because the lower and middle income purchasing power, marginal propensity to consume is higher. So they usually spend a big part of their income.
So you mentioned earlier in our discussion that our government is also putting on efforts to maintain purchasing power of its people, while we know as well as you have mentioned that our government is also slowing down its government expenditure. So how can we work on this, maintaining the purchasing power of Indonesian people amid still relatively high inflation?
Yeah. So first we have to maintain the inflation level not to exceed the increase in growth, yeah, in nominal growth, to be able to maintain purchasing power. Second, we have to improve the targeted subsidy so that we can directly target people who actually in need. And this is not impossible in the era of digitalization. You have heard the news from the Sumedang region that do direct intervention for stunting purpose, and they have managed to improve the stunting number within 2 years, right? So I imagine if we have by name, by address, we can directly intervene the poor, especially the extreme poor, then we can solve the purchasing power for the bottom 40%. For the rest of the society, then general purchasing power will relate so much to inflation and also to the growth of each industry, so that income of each industries can always improve every year following the inflation rate. So it will maintain the purchasing power of people in general. But also, like I said, the creation of new locus of growth, yeah, new industry, new higher value-added sectors, new region. Because of infrastructure, new infrastructure in certain region, we can have new area for industry, for example, or new cities that will increase growth. And those multiplier effect, I think, in general, will also finally help growth, help maintain inflation, and hence purchasing power of the people.
So we know that Minister of Finance Ibu Sri Mulyani always mentions spending better, the spirit of spending better. So this is a year ahead of the election. How can we implement that to all the regions in Indonesia?
So spending better, we're looking at the objective, yeah. First, the objective is not only growth, but also equality. So we would like to maintain that purchasing power for the bottom 40%, but also helping growth. To help growth, consumption is still 55% of the GDP. So maintaining consumption level, so the policy that maintains consumption level is really, really important. The second best is the 30% proportion coming from investment. So any policy that will increase investment, both in the short run but also in the long run, because a lot of the investment like infrastructure, we only get the return in 10, 15 years after we do the investment. That's also something that will increase growth in the medium term to long term. But in the short run is the consumption side that we have to maintain. So these are the combination of policy, but also being open to market competition so that we get the most efficient market, but also do direct subsidy as addition to the economic policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Masyita Crystallin, Special Advisor to the Minister of Finance, for joining us in Economic Outlook.
Thank you.